Hi, my name is Michael Shirkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. For YouTube channels to prosper, they have to provide you, the audience, with value. Now, the value that I try to provide you is insight into complex affairs such as, well, world affairs, global conflict, and military strategy. And I try to do this by providing insight, by trying to provide ways of understanding problems and ways of thinking about problems. So information, often like facts and figures, sometimes is less interesting to me than ways of thinking. So for instance, if you were to watch my videos about, let's say, the Polish military, the Italian military, I'm really much less interested in how many Leopard tanks they have or something like that, because I don't really care that much, but really more about like, well, what are the militaries for? What are they trying to do? What kind of military policy they have? How do we think about this matter? In this vein, from time to time, I want to talk to you about a book or some other work that provides real insight or has really informed my way of understanding, again, these complex matters such as world affairs and global conflict and military strategy. Let's call it Michael's Book Club. Silly, but whatever, let's go with it. Now, the obvious choice for the first book to talk to you about for Michael's Book Club, let's call this the inaugural episode of Michael's Book Club, is a book that has completely changed my understanding of things like, well, the Afghanistan war. Now, the book in question is Lieutenant Colonel Robert Comer's 1972 RAND study entitled Bureaucracy Does Its Thing, Institutional Constraints on U.S. Government Vietnam's Performance in Vietnam. Yes, it's a RAND study, and it's available for free as a PDF on the RAND website. So I've left a link. I put a link in the description below so that you can click on it and you can download this thing and read it for yourself. The reason why I love this book is that even though it's about Vietnam, it is the single best explanation of the U.S. failure in Afghanistan. And I'm pretty sure it applies to Iraq. And I bet for the French, this actually applies to France and Mali. I read Comer's book about Vietnam, Bureaucracy Does Its Thing, shortly after I left the U.S. government and shortly after I ended my own personal involvement with the Afghanistan war. And when I read it, I was abuzz with excitement. I thought, oh my God, this is it. This is the explanation. This book puts into words things that I was struggling to put into words myself, but couldn't really do. But somehow Robert Comer had managed to do this. If you read Comer and pretend it's really about Afghanistan, incredibly, the book totally holds up. It's 100% valid. In fact, I think that if you were to take the text, right, like download the PDF of Comer's Bureaucracy Does Its Thing, and replace every single Vietnam-specific word or name or acronym, I'm thinking MACV or Saigon or McNamara or Westmoreland or CORDS chords or something like that, and replace them with their Afghanistan war equivalent, it would read as if the whole thing had originally been written about Afghanistan. It completely stands up. It's 100% true. See, Comer gets at something in Bureaucracy Does Its Thing that I had been trying to understand about Afghanistan. During my involvement in Afghanistan, and I was involved from the late 2007 to 2009 timeframe, and I got to go to Afghanistan. I went twice, and I went to bases and whatnot, and I was just blown away by the scale of the resources that the U.S. government was pouring into the war. I was also blown away by the effort that tens of thousands of American soldiers and civilians like myself were also putting into the war. I mean, there were no slackers. Everybody was working really, really very hard trying to win. And yet, the whole somehow was far less than the sum of the parts, and we were losing. And by the way, in 2007, 2009, I was convinced that we were losing. The more I understood about the war, the more I thought that it was doomed. Comer opens the study asking more or less the same questions. How was it possible that the United States, despite all of its incredible resources, and despite the fact that it was fighting an objectively far weaker opponent, was losing the war and was getting such a poor return on its investment? Some of the problem, according to Comer, was strategy. We had a bad strategy to the extent that we even had a strategy. And sometimes he asks, did we really have a strategy? And sometimes we had what looks like a strategy, but it wasn't a good strategy. And there's a lengthy discussion in his book, and Bureaucracy Does His Thing, about strategy and was an alternative strategy, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not what's really interesting to him, and not what, and he wanted to get deeper than that, because he figured, okay, fine, setting aside the pros and cons of the U.S. strategy, such that it was, why didn't we change? We had ample time, it was a very long war, and we had large quantities of information. We knew everything we needed to know in order to understand that the strategy wasn't working, and yet we didn't change it. Well, why not? That's what Comer wanted to understand. How come we didn't see the error in our ways and change it? Or sometimes clearly we did see the error in our ways, and sometimes he would float new ideas about what to do, and some of these ideas were pretty interesting or valid even, and yet we didn't do them. We didn't implement these ideas, or we implemented them badly. That's what Comer really wanted to understand, and that's the part of Comer's book that really, I thought, hit the mark with respect to Afghanistan. Comer's main answer was bureaucratic inertia on the part of both the military and the civilian agencies who played a role in the war, the State Department foremost amongst them. He argued that despite everything, despite what they said, they came to the war with established peacetime institutional repertoires. And then they kept defaulting to those things. They kept defaulting to doing the things that they knew how to do and doing them the way they knew how to do them, whether or not those things were at all relevant, right? Whether or not they made any sense in the specific context of this specific war. They kept doing what they were familiar with, what they knew how to do. So, for example, and this is something that Comer repeats over and over again, the military kept trying to fight the war that it was designed to do, that it was designed to fight, that it was built to fight, that it was trained to fight, which is a large-scale conventional war, just like we had done in the Korean War, and just like we did in World War II. That was the default position. And yes, from time to time, people in the military would come up with new ideas and innovations, and they would experiment with stuff, but he said, ultimately, the military failed to implement these things, or it implemented them very badly. And it kept defaulting to doing the things that it was comfortable doing and doing them in the ways that it was comfortable doing those things, i.e. conventional warfare. The military kept doing its thing, and civilian agencies did no better. According to Comer, the U.S. ran the war with a peacetime management structure in largely separate bureaucratic compartments. There was, moreover, no overall management structure, and this meant that, among other things, the over-militarization was inevitable, given the military's preponderance of resources. And everybody said at the time that the war required a massive effort, not just to do the military thing, but also to improve governance and to attend to the economy, all this sort of lovely civil society stuff, et cetera, et cetera. But none of those efforts, according to Comer, really ever came anywhere close to what was required. And the alleged civil-military partnership was really more like an axle with two wheels, with one wheel being 5 times the size of the other. Now, I can imagine if you're in a vehicle and you have such an axle with such wheels, you're not actually going to go anywhere. This situation also, according to Comer, contributed to a proliferation of overlapping programs to the point where they competed for scarce resources and they got in each other's way, and that there was far less deconfliction than was required. This is something I saw over and over and again in Afghanistan, where there was a proliferation of different agencies and different offices and different commands doing different things. They're competing for resources. They're getting in each other's way. Sometimes they're even undermining what the others are doing. I saw this time and time again. For example, this is one example of many. The U.S. Special Operations Forces routinely did things that undermined the work of the provincial reconstruction teams. Everybody was aware of the problem, but nobody actually did anything about it. But what about coin doctrine? I mean, coin doctrine says very clearly. Now, we can debate the merits of coin doctrine, and I do in some of the other videos, and I put some that I've made, and I put some links in the description. But setting aside the debate about coin very clearly mandates that you have to do things differently. The military has to do things differently. The civilian side has to do things differently. And more importantly, the two things have to really be married. It has to be a joint, combined, orchestrated, and coordinated effort. Did this happen in Vietnam? And Comer says, no, actually it didn't, because coin, he says, fell between stools. He said it was everybody's business and nobody's. Coin doctrine just never really happened. Again, I saw the same thing in Afghanistan. Perhaps the best example is Petraeus himself, General Petraeus, David Petraeus. He's the guy who wrote our coin doctrine coming out of Iraq, and he was the big champion of coin. And yet, when he became the commander in Afghanistan, he was ISAF. It was like he forgot everything that he had said. He started doing all the very things that he had said in his own doctrine he shouldn't actually do. Comer also complained about the incrementalism of the U.S. response. He points out that we didn't intend to get directly involved in Vietnam, but then we did. We wanted to limit our involvement, but then we kept pushing the limits of that involvement. We got more and more involved, and our presence grew, and the number of tasks that we took upon ourselves grew. But because we never intended to do any of these things, we operated without a plan. I think that the contemporary word for this is ass backward. My word, not Comer's. think about it this way. Like if you go into a room ass backward, right, which is the opposite of head first. If you go into a room ass backward, right, your butt enters the room first, but you're looking somewhere else, your head's somewhere else, your head is trailing your butt, right? Your eyes are looking somewhere else. You're not thinking, you don't have a plan. And then boom, you discover that you're actually in the room. If you go head first, your eyes are looking forward, you have some sort of plan, you know you're going into the room, you have some notion of the steps you're going to take and where you're going to go into the room and what you're going to do. It's very different from suddenly discovering, oh my God, I'm actually in the room. And when that is the case, then you're basically just reacting to the things that you discover that are in the room that you discover yourself to be in. The ass backwardness of our effort gave even more room for the many institutions involved in the war to follow the path of least resistance and reach for the things that they were familiar with and to do the things that they knew how to do, regardless of whether any of it was actually relevant for that specific time and place and war, etc. Each organization tended to make policy that ultimately conformed with, in practice, with the things that they were most familiar with doing, and they basically ultimately would play out their standard organizational repertoires. Some of the problem that Comer is trying to describe are typical, I think, of all institutions and bureaucracies, that I think all institutions and bureaucracies are intrinsically conservative. They suffer from a degree of inertia, and it's very hard for any organization or any bureaucracy to change. This is just normal. Comer noted, however, that there were particular disincentives against adaptation. For example, and this was big, according to Comer, and he repeats it several times, he says, U.S. personnel tended to rotate after a year, meaning that there was very little institutional memory. I think the line is something like how we didn't fight the war for 12 years, rather we fought a war for a year, and then we just did that 12 years over. I don't remember who actually said that. Also, the soldiers and civilians who went to Vietnam tended to, their Vietnam tour of duty was perhaps necessary for their career, but then having checked that box, it was in their interest usually to move on and to do the next thing in their career for the sake of their career advancement. To give a very concrete contemporary example, when I was working in when I was working in Afghanistan, I was offered the opportunity to spend a year in language school learning an Afghan language. Now, the scholar in me and the analyst in me rejoiced at this idea. I thought this was awesome. I'd love to learn, I don't know, it's Tajik, I don't remember. I'd love to learn this language. It'd really be great. It would completely open up my aperture in terms of my understanding of Afghanistan. This would be tremendous, great for me personally, and then great for the war effort. This is exactly what we needed to do. Because you see, like when it comes to languages, like the U.S. government and language, despite the lip service that State Department and the CIA and the military pay for learning languages, none of it's really true. And ultimately, they're really content with machine translation and translation services, et cetera, et cetera. And also, ultimately, their attitude reminds me of, there was a crack that the American journalist from the 20th century, H.L. Mencken, allegedly said when he was asked if he had learned a foreign language. His line was, well, no, because if English is good enough for Jesus Christ, it's good enough for me. Now, Mencken was joking, but there's a lot of truth in that. Anyways, I was offered the opportunity to go. I was even offered cash incentives to go to language school. I didn't go. I thought about it, and I realized that if I went to language school, I would lose out on, I would be taking myself out of the promotion cycle. I would lose out on the opportunity to be up for promotion. I think it was going to come like the next 4 months or 6 months. I don't really remember. But ultimately, it wasn't in my interest to go to language school, my career interest. I would be a year behind. And the cash incentives that were being offered to me were not nearly commensurate with losing out a year in the promotion cycle. It wasn't enough. What mattered more in terms of even just the quantity of money, it was far more interesting for me, personally and for my family, for me to jump up to the next level in the U.S. federal government pay scale. And so I didn't do it, notwithstanding the fact that from the point of view of the war effort, it would have been really good. And, here's again an example of how the U.S. government really fell short in trying to incentivize things that are actually good for the war effort. Getting promoted when you're in the CIA requires meeting certain measurements and certain requirements determined by the bureaucracy. It's very bureaucratic. Taking one for the team and going to language school for a year was not among them. It was not going to help my career in the long term or get me promoted. Comer also complained that throughout the war, we deliberately overlooked the sheer incapacity of our partner, in this case, the government of South Vietnam. But this certainly applies to Afghanistan under Karzai, or for the French, for Mali under Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, to achieve what we needed them to achieve for the war to work. We knew it, but we didn't act upon it. We didn't take over or use our leverage over them, not really. Nor did we deduce that without the war, without them being effective partners, the war was ultimately doomed, and then maybe we should pull up stakes and leave. Maybe that would have been the smart thing to do. Comer said that the State Department insisted on treating the government of South Vietnam as it would any other sovereign nation. And that out of scruple, they didn't want to get involved, they didn't want to interfere. Comer thought this was naive because, after all, there was a war going on, and perhaps it would behoove us to intervene from time to time and to use our leverage. This absolutely resonated for me for a number of reasons, among them the fact that the U.S. government refused really to use this leverage on the Karzai administration, although sometimes we'd yell at Karzai, which just had no effect whatsoever because all this did was kind of piss him off. But I also found in my interactions with state about Afghanistan, I found these interactions exasperating. I became convinced that the state was blithely unaware that there was even a war going on. State did not want the war to interfere with its normal way of doing business, or of managing its personnel, or of training its personnel, etc. State wanted to keep doing its thing. Similarly, Comer also thought that it would have been a good idea to much more thoroughly integrate the activities of the South Vietnamese government and the South Vietnamese military with our own activities. So he thought that there needed to be unified command. He thought that South Vietnamese units needed to be integrated into the American command structure. He even talked about South Vietnamese soldiers basically being integrated into American units. By the way, this is what the French did routinely in Indochina and elsewhere during the colonial wars, and it usually worked. It worked quite well. Comer uses the French term encadrement to create a framework. The idea is that you would have French officers and NCOs, but you would have indigenous forces. It worked. He was thinking the same kind of things for Vietnam. There are some small-scale examples of this happening, but really on a very small scale in the American-Vietnam War. Comer says that the reason why the U.S. military didn't do this at a larger scale was no more. The only reason why was because the U.S. government didn't do this, wasn't comfortable doing it, and therefore wouldn't do it. It just refused. Comer closes the study with some interesting lessons learned. Perhaps the most important one that he leads with is that atypical problems demand tailored solutions. This seems self-evident, but it's strikingly difficult for bureaucracies to actually do. This is something I've written about, something I've spoken about. This very week, I'm going to be presenting a paper at the Defense Security Cooperation University. They're holding a conference this week on security cooperation, security assistance. Now, in this paper, what I say is that when the U.S. government provides security assistance, certainly for African countries, and I believe this is true elsewhere, the U.S. government rolls up and says, like, hey, we're going to provide security assistance. And what it has is like a chest full of ready-to-wear security assistance programs. And this is what it's going to peddle. It doesn't matter if the garments that you pulls out of the chest, the ready-to-wear garments, are too big or too little or too this, too much that. Maybe it's too light when you need heavier garments or too heavy when you need lighter garments, etc. But that's what they work with. And maybe the nation team that exists at the embassies will be careful about maybe picking out this garment rather than that garment because it figures maybe this garment's a better fit. But ultimately, it's all ready to wear. None of it's bespoke and none of it's made to measure. Now, the U.S. government, the State Department and the Defense Department will say to me, Michael, that's not true. We tailor our programs for the specific needs of each particular country. It's just not true. It really isn't true. They're not lying. This is not bad faith. It's just a question of bureaucracy doing its thing. This is how the bureaucracy functions. And I question whether or not the U.S. government is even capable of doing bespoke or made to measure, rather than falling back on, as Comer puts it, these established repertoire of doing things, of using these ready-to-wear programs that this is what we got and this is how we do it. So we're going to keep doing what we do because bureaucracies will do their thing. Now, the bottom line for me is that what I get out of Comer is the idea that the success or failure of a war can depend on not just on things like strategy or military capabilities, again, how many leopard tanks do you have, but really just on mundane matters such as management and human resources, particularly when you have so many resources. It's how you use the resources, how you coordinate the resources, how you implement all this, how do you conceive of a strategy and make sure that everybody involved fulfills that strategy and carries out that strategy. And we can't just show up at a war as if it were business as usual and be unwilling or incapable of adapting or changing. I associate this problem with the way we conceive of limited wars, or the way we've conceived of limited wars, at least since World War II. And basically, like, the way is this. Like, we have this notion that there's a big war, right? Capital B, emphatic, all caps, right? Big war, which requires an all-out effort, in which it is important and necessary to innovate and do whatever we need to do in order to win. And then we've got the limited wars. And the way we approach limited wars is we think in terms of, okay, we wish to achieve a limited objective. And for this, we're going to measure out limited means. But we tend to do it in a way, we tend to think that this is something that our institutions, military and civilian, should be able to do in the normal course of activities. Imagine a day in the life. You're going to wake up, you're going to have coffee, you're going to take the kids to school, after packing them lunch, you're going to do this, do that. Oh, 3 o'clock, you're going to fight a war. 4 o'clock, you're going to go to a PTA meeting, you're going to do this, that, the other thing. It's just a normal day in the life. It's business as usual, and one of the activities that you're doing happens to be fighting a war. It makes sense, right? But it also lends itself to not taking seriously the need to shift out of a business as usual model, and that there has to be change. It has to be hard thinking about, well, how do we actually do this? And it maybe requires doing something differently or doing something absolutely new. So if this means reconfiguring our promotion system, do it. If it means creating a unified command structure to enforce compliance with policy and strategy, then yeah, absolutely. If it means that we have to do sober assessments of our own ability to do the things that we need to do, then we need to do that. That has to become an imperative. This, of course, is really very hard to do. Nobody wants to admit to themselves, as much as to anybody else, that they're not capable of doing the thing that they're being asked to do, the thing that they're supposed to be able to do. And certainly nobody wants to suggest that the much vaunted U.S. military perhaps is incapable of learning or doing things right. Ultimately, the extent to which strategy is often said to boil down to aligning ways and means with selected ends means that we're not going to achieve our ends if our ways and means do not actually fit. Now, if you like this video, please like and subscribe. Please let me know below if you have any thoughts about this. I mean, is Comer on the right track? Am I wrong to think that this is really a meaningful explanation for anything? Or perhaps there are other flaws, or perhaps there are other things that we need to be doing in order to better manage these efforts. Also, please check out my Substack. There's a link in the description. It's also called Pax Americana. And you can come find me on LinkedIn and Twitter. Again, links in the description. And plus, I have a link to my own website, michaelsharkin.com. Thank you very much, and please stay tuned. We've got many more videos in the pipeline, including right now I'm working on one about the Finnish military. I guess maybe I'll talk about leopard tanks and that. Yeah, I'll probably. And that's it. So thank you. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Bye-bye.